Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Migration Studies webinar, Assessing the State of the US Refugee Admissions Program, Looking Back and Moving Forward. Today is World Refugee Day, and it's appropriate that we measure the progress the United States has made in the vital area of refugee admissions. In doing so, we have to take into consideration the reality in the world today with regard to refugees and forcibly displaced persons. According to UNHCR's Global Trends Report, released just last week, there are 120 million forcibly displaced persons as of May, with 43.4 million refugees, 31 million under the UNHCR mandate. UNHCR says that nearly 3 million refugees will require resettlement in 2025, which is a 20% increase over 2024. And there are nearly 70 million internally displaced around the world. We have several experts today to sort of dissect these trends and to examine how the U.S. has responded to them. They will help measure how much progress the U.S. has made in resettlement since it resettled a record low 11,411 refugees in FY 2021, the last year of the Trump administration. I will introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. And once they have presented, there will be a Q&A session. Please note that to ask a question, you need to put it in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So our first speaker is going to be Kelly Ryan. She's the president of Jesuit Refugee Services USA. Kelly has held several positions in government, including Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department, and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Immigration and Border Security at the Department of Homeland Security. Our second speaker will be Mark Hetfield. Mark has been President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society since 2013. He also worked for the Immigration Naturalization Service and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Our last speaker, but certainly not least, is Wendy Young. She's the founder and president of Kids in Need of Defense, and she's held that post since 2009. Wendy was previously chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Immigration, and she's worked for UNHCR, the Women's Refugee Commission, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So we have a stellar panel to discuss this issue today. So I'll now call on Kelly to start the discussion. Kelly, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for having us here on behalf of JRS-USA. I thought I'd take us back a bit to give some context in history and then try to move us forward. And I think Mark will jump in as well on some of the more recent trends, but I thought it was important to do that. One thing I would say about the Refugee Resettlement Program in the United States with great pride is it is, I think, the strongest and best program in the world. It's certainly had challenges. There's no doubt about it, but the fact that it's based on government, NGO, and UNHCR tripartite relations, the fact that it's shown great flexibility, even in times of great challenges, I think are really important hallmarks that we should all be proud of. I want to take us back to the time after 9/11, and I was at State Department then in charge of refugee admissions to the United States. And there was a misconception at that time that we would never be able to have a large number of refugees come again, and that somehow security measures or other outside obstacles would prevent us from enjoying supporting that program and enlarging it again. In fact, we were able within 2 years after 9/11 to get to the president's goal of 75,000. And I use that word goal intentionally. It was not, a ceiling, but rather a goal to attain. And we did that a number of ways. But one of the things that had happened prior to 9/11 is that we hadn't been as creative in identifying refugees in need of resettlement. So UNHCR was very helpful in some places in the world, and in other places there wasn't this active desire or even agreement that resettlement would be an appropriate, durable solution for 1 or 10 or 100 refugees. There are a couple of things that we put into place, and some still, when the Biden administration came in, I turned them to the report that I had David Martin author about reforms to the program, and they noted at the time that not all of them had been achieved. So I still think there's some areas that we can still consider to refine and improve, and always in any program there's those opportunities. But I think the David Martin report stands well for laying out some of the obstacles to a truly robust, flexible program. The second thing was that we have very talented NGOs around the world. And one thing I'm quite proud of was expanding the use of refugee referral from NGOs. So we conducted programs and trainings in Cairo and Moscow and Thailand. And some of the strongest cases we got actually were cases that those people were not able to access UNHCR offices. So it was complementary to the work that UNHCR was doing, no way conflicting with it. And I think it was a very valuable activity that we put into place. I can point also to my colleague Sasha Chanoff and the work that we did together to identify these Banyamulenge Tutsis who'd been survivors of a machete attack. They'd been dispersed around, and we were able to identify them and refer them to the US program. So I think there's some clever things we've done, and I'm very pleased to see particularly the work of DHS and PRM most recently in trying to improve both to use the word we use inside the government, the pipeline of people that are being referred to the program, but also looking at the range of resettlement needs around the world. I'd also like to do kind of a salute to our colleague and old friend Erica Feller, the former Associate High Commissioner for Protection. And I think the work that she did around the strategic use of resettlement is really as important now as then, because if resettlement is used correctly, it can lead to other durable solutions for those who aren't given resettlement. So I think those are really important elements. The last thing I'd like to talk about very briefly is integration in the United States. In the past couple of years before becoming president of JRS, I was in charge of citizenship promotion. And so I was able to meet with a lot of refugees and asylees in the United States to urge them to seek citizenship. But what I saw there, and also with the program that DHS set up, USCIS set up with the Afghan nationals, I saw a real need for, and I see great innovation now on our resettlement in terms of bringing in the private sector, in terms of bringing in the states and the local law enforcement and offices of new Americans. So I think this is actually working in a way better than it ever has before. I think HHS deserves credit for involving the state refugee coordinators and the state offices of new Americans more broadly than it had perhaps in the past. So I think these are also really positive changes that I could commend just to make sure that all of our refugees, whether they came from an overseas program or admitted as asylees, are getting fully integrated and enjoying the benefits and rights of US citizens when they become citizens. So those are some of the kind of things that I thought might be important to flag on this World Refugee Day. So back to you, Kevin.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Forgive me. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Mark, we'll turn to you now for your presentation.
Thanks. Thanks, Kevin. And thank you, Kelly. Great to be here. Happy World Refugee Day. I want to start by saying that the United States and other countries resettle refugees, not because it's beneficial to the country, not because they contribute to the country economically, but because this is a humanitarian program. That being said, it just so happens that refugees are tremendous contributors to our economy and to our country. The Health and Human Services Department released a study this year where they found that over a 15-year period, resettled refugees contribute $124 billion more in state, local, and federal taxes than they take in services. So in the short term, the refugee resettlement program, sure, it costs money to run, but it is a really good investment for this country. And again, that's just a side benefit. That's just a collateral benefit, because the fact is that this program also saves lives and solves the problem of mass displacement, which needs solving, because as you know, there are now more forcibly displaced persons in the world than ever before, as the UNHCR revealed earlier today. The refugee program did take a beating during the last administration, during the Trump administration. We were down, we had about 300 affiliates, 300 resettlement sites around the United States, between the 9 refugee resettlement agencies when President Trump took office. And by the time he left, there were only 200 operating sites. The number had decreased. The number of the resettlement ceiling had decreased from 110,000 to 15,000 during that period of time. So even those 200 surviving sites were operating with a skeleton crew, with really thin staff. The good news is that we have revived. This administration has, in fact, invested a lot in the refugee program. And we actually have more resettlement sites now than we had in 2016. There are now 350 sites around the country where refugees are resettled through agencies like HIAS and the 9 other refugee agencies. So we're back. And then in addition to that, the refugee program has also become much more accessible. In other words, you don't need to work through a resettlement agency anymore if you want to welcome refugees into your community. There are now new ways to do so. There is the Welcome Corps, which allows private groups of individuals or private citizens to sponsor refugees. And recently, named sponsorships have been launched, which means that you can actually identify a refugee that you know, maybe a relative of yours, who needs protection, who needs access to the program, and that will give them it provides them a pathway with an interview for refugee status. And if they meet the refugee definition and otherwise qualify, they could be resettled through a private sponsorship of those people who are sponsoring him or her. So there's all these new avenues that have opened up to bring in refugees through the safe and orderly process that is the US Refugee Admissions Program. I'll also say that there have been more reforms to the resettlement program to make the process work better and more efficiently in the last 2 years than there were in the previous 25. Now there are simultaneous processes are going on, which allows a refugee to be processed much more quickly, yet without skipping any of the vetting procedures which are necessary to make sure that every refugee who comes into this country is both qualified, but also does not pose a security risk. And of course, we know that refugees, there have been times in this country where refugee admissions have been restricted due to fear of admitting people to this country. The fact of the matter is that they have greatly contributed, and there has never been an actual time when admitting refugees has created any true security issues for this country. We are the number of refugees expected to come into this country this year, while the ceiling is 125,000. We expect over 100,000 to come in, which is definitely something to celebrate. We're not going to make 125,000, unfortunately, in all likelihood, not because of an issue with identifying refugees, not because of a lack of need, but frankly, because domestic capacity is being challenged right now by the global and national housing crisis. It's very difficult for us to find affordable housing for refugees to move into, which is why private sponsorships are so expensive, so important, because private sponsors share their responsibility of finding housing, which used to be just the responsibility of resettlement agencies. But we do need an increase in resources, both private and federal, to make that number of 125,000 because of the cost of housing and of putting a shelter, putting a roof over resettled refugees' heads. The good news is, in this current economy, we can get refugees employed and self-sufficient almost immediately. That's always been an important success goal of the program, but we need to put them in safe housing as well. And so that's the biggest challenge right now that's confronting the refugee program. And we're working on all sorts of creative solutions to try to address it. But the fact of the matter is, this is not a problem that's unique to refugees, but of course, it's a problem that confronts the entire country. But again, the news is good. We have rebuilt the refugee program in partnership with the State Department, US Citizenship and Immigration Services, and Health and Human Services. And together we can help mitigate the global displacement crisis that the world is facing. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Mark, for that positive view and summary. Finally, we'll turn to Wendy Young to give us her perspective on children's issues.
Thanks, Kevin, and happy World Refugee Day, everybody. It's an important annual celebration of the contributions that refugees make, as Mark has underscored and Kelly has underscored. Always hard to follow these two, by the way. But it's also an important moment to pause and remember just the millions and millions of people who've been forcibly displaced around the world, facing very dire circumstances in many, many cases. So I am president of Kids in Need of Defense. We are the leading organization working with unaccompanied and separated children in the United States. But relevant to this discussion, in recent years, we've expanded our programming extensively into Mexico, Central America, and Europe. So to focus a bit on refugee resettlement, and then I'm going to segue for a couple of minutes into the complementary program of the US asylum system, through which those who are seeking protection present themselves more spontaneously at a US border and request refugee protection in order to enter. But starting with resettlement, first I'd like to frame it out similar to what Mark was saying. This is a key humanitarian program within the US immigration system. It's a long-standing program. It's one that I think the United States can be very, very proud of, because it really stands for our partnership with the world and our caring for people who have fled circumstances very often beyond their control that are very often life-threatening. It's also, I think, an important tool of foreign policy. It's a way for us to share the responsibility with other countries around the world as they host forcibly displaced populations. I also think that it occupies a unique space right now. There's, as you know, a lot of controversy, visibility around what's happening at the US border in terms of the numbers of arrivals really having, to put it plainly, skyrocketed over recent years. Resettlement is one of those programs that actually represents both a humane and orderly process, which I think is something that we need to focus on to see if we can take some of the pressure off the US border. So turning specifically to the role that kind plays in focusing on children, roughly 42% of the world's refugees are in fact children. Not all of them are unaccompanied or separated. Many are with their families. But as children, they present a unique vulnerability in the system that really, the way I often say it is, we can't expect them to step into a system that's designed for adults. We have to meet them as children and accommodate those very unique needs. Within the resettlement context, there's been a longstanding program specifically for unaccompanied refugee minors, which traditionally has admitted a few hundred children a year into the United States and provided them with special supports once here so that they can get their feet on the ground and really thrive and become successful members of US society. And it's a program that we can be quite proud of, I think. More specifically, in recent years, there's been a program that's particular for children from Central America, the Central America Minors Refugee Resettlement Program, or CAM as it's known. This program was stood up specifically to address the needs of displaced children from Central America with a focus on Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, out of recognition that we were seeing a dramatically increased number of children from these countries arriving at the US border. So the CAM program became an important outlet, if you will, to allow children to actually apply from the home country for refugee resettlement to the United States. unique to the program, if a child didn't qualify for the very specific refugee definition under US and international law, they would be considered for parole, which is a more discretionary program, if you will, that's available under US law. The CAM program became a really, and continues to be a really critical mechanism for a number of reasons. One is, again, most importantly, it saves children that very, very dangerous voyage across Latin America to reach the US southern border. So it's a means to protect them from smuggling, from trafficking, and from the many, many abuses that they experience throughout a very difficult journey. KIND has been a participant in this program to help children, to identify children in need of resettlement and to help them navigate the process. Two things on that front. One is that in order to qualify for CAM, the child must have a family member already present in the United States who can apply for the child. So part of our outreach is actually to families who can sponsor these children. Second thing I will say, and this is going to some policy recommendations that KIND has been promoting, the resettlement system is, like any immigration system, it can be fairly complicated. So to expect a child to navigate that system without assistance is very challenging. So we've been encouraging the administration, and there is some interest in ensuring that children have access to somebody who can advise and guide them through the process, i.e., more specifically, attorneys who are expert in refugee law. We're not proposing that this be a formal representation, as you would see in a domestic immigration court, but rather that the lawyer be there just to advise the child. These are the questions you're going to be asked. This is what you should focus on when you're interviewed for the process, to really give them that extra hand, if you will, that children need to navigate what are pretty complicated systems. Second recommendation that I would offer is the CAM program really focuses on kids applying in country. We would love to see this extended to third countries, host countries, to do additional processing, again, as a mechanism to prevent children or provide children with an alternative to the dangerous trip throughout the region. I will stop there. I think it's important to remember as we look at the refugee population globally, to put a human face on it. And kids are one of the most vulnerable groups within the global refugee population that really deserve extra attention and extra focus to ensure that as we extend protection to communities throughout the world, that their needs are addressed adequately. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, everyone, if you want to ask a question, just write it in the Q&A box and we will get to them. I just want to add a couple of points, that a couple of initiatives that the administration has undertaken that might fall a little bit out of the contours of the refugee program itself, but is a sort of a combined effort between DHS and the Department of State. One is the use of, and Wendy referred to it, humanitarian parole, which has been very generously used by the Biden administration to bring in large groups of refugee-like populations. And doing so, it was helpful to do it expeditiously to actually bring in a large number. The Afghans are the prime example, where about 78,000 were brought in after the end of the Afghan war. And then, of course, the Ukrainians, of which I think are about 190,000 now that have come through humanitarian parole into the US. This is a tool that heretofore hasn't been used in such quantity, but it was very useful in certainly those two conflicts. Of course, the challenge there is the benefits that are given to those populations do not equate to what someone gets during coming through the US Refugee Admissions Program, especially permanent residency or a path to permanent residency. And of course, Congress needs to decide that with those populations. Mark mentioned the Welcome Corps, another great initiative, which gets the public more involved in the US Refugee Program and builds support for the US Refugee Program. And thirdly is an initiative called Safe Mobility Offices, which have been launched in several countries in Latin America and actually have benefited the refugee program in that they have been able to identify a lot of refugees from that region and refer them to the program, as many as 10,000 as we speak. So I just wanted to mention those initiatives that have helped refugee-like populations, but may not have come directly through the US Refugee Program. I also like to mention the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which was launched, I believe, in 2010 by Senator Kennedy's hand, I believe, that allows our allies in Iraq and Afghanistan and others who helped us during those wars to come in. We anticipate there'll be about 30,000 SIVs this year, which is quite an increase over previous years. And it's a way for the U.S. to keep their commitment to these, to Afghans, Iraqis, and others who risk their lives on behalf of our servicemen. So that's another thing I wanted to highlight. And one last point before we turn to the questions is this administration has taken refugees from areas that the previous administration did not. Specifically Africa and Latin America. Certainly Latin America has increased significantly in the resettlement. For example, in FY20 and FY2021, the Trump administration took in 1,348 refugees from Latin America. And in the same year, in the last 2 years, the Biden administration has taken in 23,000. So that's quite an increase. And then in Africa, in FY20 and 21, the Trump administration took in 10,379 refugees from Africa. And over the last 3.5 years, the Biden administration has accepted 70,000 refugees from Africa. So it's sort of a shift in the focus of where the refugees are coming from in the world. So I just thought I would mention those statistics to round out the discussion. We have some time for questions. Please enter them in the Q&A. I'd like to sort of ask a question to the panel, if possible. And, so you touched upon some of these things, but assuming that the Biden administration continues, and certainly from your remarks, we've seen that they've done quite a great job in restoring the program. What are some areas for improvement that you see over the next 2, 3, 4 years that would really bring the program to its highest level, and most effective level, including as a foreign policy tool, for the U.S. to leverage other countries to help with refugees and other things? Anyone want to take a stab at that? And I know, Wendy, you mentioned a couple of things, maybe Mark. There's always room for improvement, right?
I can jump in here if that's helpful, and interested to hear what Mark and Kelly might have to add. I would say one thing I would point to that I think is very promising is the opening of these SMOs in the region, Kevin, that you mentioned, the safety mobility offices. We had a team go down to Colombia to look at that processing, and they came back, basically their first thing they said to me is, wow. And it seems to be a model for efficient processing that doesn't sacrifice the kind of vetting that the country has an interest in doing with individuals who apply for refugee resettlement. They were sharing with me that there's basically these SMOs are almost like a one-stop shop, and it's taking as little as 9 days to turn these cases around. And I know Kelly, Mark, and I grew up in an era where it was just expected it would take years to do resettlement processing. So I think that's something quite hopeful that I would hope that the Biden administration would continue to pursue, or let's ask the alternative, because it seems to me like it's something good for refugees and good for the system.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Wendy said. Of course, it's worth noting that in the first 2 years of this administration, they brought in, or in the last 2 years, this administration has brought in 32,000 refugees whose cases were pending for 5 years or more. And that goes to show you how long it used to take to process refugees. Now, because of the changes they've made, they're able to process refugees in a matter of months, which is truly remarkable process. Wendy's right. We used the US refugee system talking point used to be, it takes 18 months to 36 months to process a refugee. Therefore, the system is safe and secure. And that was a mistake. It's not right to equate the amount of time it takes with the safety and security of the system. You can do vetting quickly and efficiently. You don't need to take 3 years to do it. 18 to 36 months isn't safe. It's just slow. And now the US refugee process is safer and faster than ever. So it's much more efficient. So that's positive. The other thing I mentioned, which needs to be done, is that the refugee program has to be resourced appropriately. Refugees have to be put in housing upon arrival that is safe and affordable, and until they get on their feet after just a few months and can pay rent on their own. But there needs to be assistance with safe and affordable housing, which is, again, the constraint on the program at the moment. And the third thing I would say is that Kevin's right. He identified one of my pet peeves, which is this administration's heavy use of humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole is not a new thing. It used to be before 1980. The only way refugees really came in was through humanitarian parole. And there's no pathway to a green card. There's no pathway to citizenship. There's no pathway to family reunification through the parole mechanism, unless you find some other way to get some other status while you're in the United States. The refugee admissions program solves all those issues. You get a green card after 12 months. You get to apply for citizenship after 5 years. It's really important to find ways to bring in more people as refugees who qualify as refugees, rather than using the parole process. So it's really important to look at that. And finally, I would say, and I've said this many times, to me, the high point in the refugee program, one of the high points was actually in 1999, when the US government realized that they can actually bring refugees here and complete refugee processing here in the United States, when they evacuated thousands of Kosovars from Macedonia and brought them to Fort Dix for processing as refugees. And so that's something I wish that had been done with the Afghans who were evacuated, who are now in parole and have to find some other way, i.e. the asylum system, which is already overburdened and overloaded, to regularize their status. So these are the things the U.S. program should be looking at.
This is Kelly. I would like to agree with everything that Wendy and Mark said. I'm just going to maybe make 4 quick points. We did actually have emergency resettlement in the Bush administration, which kind of ended. And I really think the SMOs and doing things more efficiently is the most important structural change that's happened in a decade. And I completely salute the administration for making that happen. And I think there's more that could happen. And I agree with Mark that the length of time does not indicate the strength of the adjudication. So we have robust security checks that go on, and the efficiencies that you create actually make sure that you can focus on all of the security pieces separately, and it's very good for the program, and I strongly support it. I would say, I think that in the coming years, we can look more again at private sponsorship. I think there's more that could happen in that arena, not to undermine the resettlement that's done through our excellent resettlement agencies, but also, again, as a complementary tool. I would also say on the identification piece, I think one of the things that would be helpful to take a look at again, sort of big picture, is looking at really protracted situations and using resettlement to kind of push out durable solutions for others. So we did this successfully with a group of Bhutanese in Nepal, where we were resettled basically the vast majority, but we did get agreement by the Bhutanese government to accept the return of its nationals for a small number who wanted to go home. Same happened in our large-scale resettlement of the Burmese out of Thailand. So I think looking at protracted situations more aggressively and finding durable solutions for everyone would be an interesting exercise, particularly when you think of this 19-year wait on average that people are essentially in limbo in their refugee circumstances, sometimes in very difficult circumstances with not access to education or food, hygiene, etc. Actually, I was going to say that, the refugee resettlement program is doing so well. I wish that the asylum program in the United States were doing equally well. We have 1 million people in the backlog waiting for their claim, and justice delayed is justice denied. So I'd like to see some of the reforms that have happened on the refugee side, because actually we're interviewing the same type of people, be able to be brought into the asylum side of the equation. I think that would be really, really important to do. I was heavily involved in the Fort Dix model. It was an excellent use of parole, and we did do resettlement. I would, again, for anyone listening, I would like to salute the Afghan organizations that supported the Afghan arrivals when they came. And with Operations Allies Welcome. So we've had 2 cohorts of people. We've had people paroled in who have to seek asylum. There are children in that group that came with family members that are not their parents. And so we're still struggling, I think, to make sure that all those kids get asylum. If anyone's listening on that call and knows an Afghan family, please make sure to ask if the children have applied, because many of them have not yet applied. Second, I would say that the SIJ program is a really important program. We've had SIJ throughout the world, but the Afghan and Iraq programs really were instrumental in recognizing the bravery of our colleagues who served in our embassies abroad. And I think really, if you read people's resumes that came from that, they're just astonishing people. So the SIJs that have come through the Afghan program in particular lately have been able to adjust, and many of them already very successfully employed based on their past experience with the U.S. government. So it's not refugee program per se, but it is an important protection tool that has permitted us to welcome them to the United States. So those are a few of the things I thought I might flag for everyone.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for all your answers on that. I'm going to go to the Q&A box now and ask you a question. I'm just going to read it. It's from Sarah Matusek with this Christian Science Monitor. She's wondering whether any of today's speakers should support an annual ceiling or quota on asylum applications or determinations akin to the refugee admission ceiling as a way to try to manage the scale of demand for asylum that we're seeing at the southern border. And has there ever been an interest historically to limit that asylum demand numerically like we have for the refugee cap? Interesting question. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I can start. It is interesting that there was an approach like that that the U.S. took for a time, where they didn't put a cap on asylees, but they did put a cap on the number of green cards that asylees could get each year. And the cap was pretty low. I think it was about, like 10,000 a year. And the cap was lifted by the Homeland, I believe it was lifted by the Homeland Security Act or something like that in the early 2000s. But they didn't limit access to asylum. They just limited access to green cards for asylees. I think it's a very bad idea to put, and probably it is a contravention of the Refugee Convention, frankly, to put a cap on the number of asylees that a country will accept. And you look, the United States feels like it's having a crisis, but look at other countries that, as a pure accident of geography, have to host far more refugees than we do because they have no other place to flee to. Iran hosts 4 million refugees. Turkey hosts 3.3 million. Colombia hosts just about 3 million refugees. These are huge numbers. And Lebanon, the number is also a significant portion of the population of a very small country. The key is to try to promote international responsibility sharing, to make sure that refugees are able to find a solution and are able to be resettled to other countries. But we really can't set an example by closing the door on asylees. There are other ways to manage that flow, like quickly identifying who actually is an asylee, who's entitled to refugee status and who's not, and giving protection to those who are, and removing those who are not just closing the door. So that's my take.
Kevin, to jump in here, I echo everything Mark just said. I really believe that the idea of caps on asylum seekers and asylees is absolutely the wrong solution to a complex challenge for our country. And I think that the real way to fix this is to do exactly what Mark suggested, invest in the system, and Kelly as well, make the system efficient so that adjudications are happening much more rapidly than we're currently seeing. For children, we're seeing on average our cases are lasting 4.5 years. So that's just an unsustainable backlog. So we really need to find the fixes on that front. Secondly, I also think that we need to lean into the complexity of the arrivals at our southern border. Some people will qualify for asylum or refugee status. Some are here because they're fleeing situations that are not survivable, general violence, but they may not qualify as a refugee. Others are coming for economic reasons. We need to find ways to sort out the population arriving at the border and address them separately. There is a growing and I think encouraging conversation around creating complementary pathways to asylum and refugee status, which is really grounded in this idea of let's figure out why people are on the move and then address it through that lens so that it's a much more individualized approach, if you will, rather than kind of funneling everybody into the asylum system. Because at the end of the day, if you put on a numerical cap, what you're going to end up doing is sacrificing people who do qualify for refugee status. And that means they're being returned back to situations of danger.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Mark.
This is Kelly. I'm just going to jump in and agree. I would also say that, even if it were legal, not only is it a bad idea from just a policy perspective, it's bad from an administrative perspective. It would lead to all sorts of difficulties, as we've had with the trafficking visas, which do have a cap. And so people wait for a long time for their green card. And I would say also that this is also delaying full integration to the United States. Our system is based on the idea, if you get asylum, we'd like you to stay and we'd like you to adjust a green card and become a citizen. And we value those people's contributions, whether as refugees or asylees. This then limits their opportunity to apply for citizenship and get full integration. And we know that refugees and asylees, once they do get citizenship, enjoy better social and economic outcomes. So it's a win-win for our country, for the refugee as well. So that's, I think, another reason why we would never want to go for a cap.
Thank you. We have a question, a double whammy from Alyssa Resnick, NPR partner station in Phoenix. The first part of it is about the safe mobility offices, and some advocates have said that the process has slowed dramatically due to overwhelming interest, which isn't surprising. And some of the applications are no longer even being accepted in some cases. Is the program still a viable option for people forced from their homes? That's the first question. Second is, do you see the Biden administration's executive action limiting asylum access at the border affecting the overall needs of refugees and refugee resettlement programs in the U.S.? So safe mobility offices slowing down is the first sort of question. And then how does the restrictions on asylum impact the needs of refugees and refugee resettlement programs?
I'll start. I think the SMOs have actually been more successful than we thought they would be. And that's one of the reasons why they've become a little bit overwhelmed, but not in the sense that the border is overwhelmed right now, right? It is a good, safe alternative and should be enhanced. Also, if it can, be used to provide at least a message to people as to who may be eligible and who is not, to really encourage that as a safe and legal alternative to other means of trying to get to the United States to find protection. So I think it's a sign of the SMO's success. But of course, we know that demand is going to outweigh supply. So this is always going to be a management issue. In terms of the impact of the border crisis with the refugee resettlement program, the refugee resettlement program is a safe and legal and orderly pathway to seeking asylum by crossing a border on your own under much more dangerous circumstances. So frankly, the asylum crisis at the border should make the case for a stronger resettlement program. And I think that initially this administration did stumble, right? Initially, this administration delayed enhancements to the resettlement program, delayed signing a new presidential determination after President Biden took office because of the situation at the border. Jen Psaki admitted, or she didn't admit as much, the president admitted as much when he finally signed a new presidential determination after he took office. Took him until the Memorial Day, I believe, to sign it, even though he said there was a border crisis when he took office in January, a resettlement crisis when he took office in January. But that being said, now the administration is clearly trying to build up the resettlement system, has really invested well in it, and has made it a clear, safe, legal pathway alternative to more dangerous ways of getting protection. Over.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to go to another question here. Fethi Kellis. She wants anyone to comment on the topic of refugee integration and what the criteria by which integration is defined and measured, and who counts as an integrated refugee. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
I could start maybe. So this is something the U.S. has looked at quite a bit, and I think some of the best benchmarks are actually the international ones that the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has created. The OECD has a migration report called Settling In. So it talks about language acquisition, education, feelings of belonging. It has a lot of criteria that I think are really helpful when you're trying to figure it out. The United States program, I would argue, is the most successful integration program in the world of the resettlement countries. And I think the reason for that is that it's localized. So resettlement happens at the local level. It's not imposed from the federal government. I think there's a false narrative that we have sink or swim, but I think our communities are the places that people get integrated. And the US program is largely based on economic integration through job acquisition very early on, which is challenging for some, but actually in many ways helps people get their feelings of agency back and their independence, which has been often challenged by the circumstance of being dependent either in a camp or in a situation where you're not in control of your life. So there are some really good indicators out there. The Office of Refugee Resettlement at HHS and PRM work on this all the time. I don't think, in the early days of our program, we talked about how many spoons and knives and forks were in the drawer when somebody arrived. I think that's less important than, is there somebody saying hello, greeting you at the airport, telling you where you need to go, introducing you to the local community, including the law enforcement community, so that you feel safe. Obviously, it's a complicated thing when 100,000 people are being resettled throughout the country in various places with different economic situations. But the good news in the United States is that we have such a strong resettlement program that it helps our refugees, I think, do better than in other places where they're required to, not work and spend years in formal education classes, which can be a challenge too. So over to you.
Thank you. Kelly, I'm going to stick with you because there's a question for you from Cassandra McClellan. She wants you to talk a little bit about trainings for improving coordination with NGOs on resettlement referrals such as those in Cairo.
Thank you, Cassandra. So this is something I'm very personally interested in, and I hope at some point my organization will actually be doing them as well. Mark's team has done them. I'm not sure if Kind has done them, but basically it's a little short story. I was the head of the U.S. delegation to the annual Tripartite Commission in Geneva. And in those meetings, the UNHCR colleagues get up and say what the resettlement needs are in various parts of the world. And so in this one particular one, they had identified 0 resettlement needs in Southeast Asia. So I raised my hand and said, I think there's a lot. And I went through various parts of Southeast Asia that needed resettlement. I thought resettlement could be a durable solution and it would be strategic. So I identified Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, a lot of places where there were refugees that needed resettlement. But there wasn't the capacity at that point in the regional office. So we set up a program with trusted NGO assistance agencies to identify who did assistance to refugees to identify people. We created a form, and those cases were referred to the U.S. government. We did this in Cairo and Moscow, elsewhere, and Mark and I participated in we did the training sessions in Cairo, for example. And when I say that this was valuable, numerically it wasn't a large number, but the risk of harm to those refugees was very significant, and the impact it had actually propelled UNHCR to help us to identify others that needed resettlement. So I thought it was a very valuable exercise, and I'd like to see the State Department work with us and HIAS and others to continue it. And I think that it can be a small but very effective tool.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to turn to Mark now because he touched upon this question from Granine O'Hara. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. What is the average processing time with the improvements and reforms that you mentioned, Mark? And I know you said a few months. Is that what we're looking at now?
Sure. I want to quickly just tag along on Kelly's answer first.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. And because in fact, this administration did launch with HIAS, Refuge Point, and IRAP, the Equitable Resettlement Access Consortium, which HIAS leads with those other two agencies, and that is creating a worldwide capacity for NGO referrals into the resettlement system to identify the more vulnerable refugees around the world who need resettlement and not require them to go through UNHCR. Again, this is a good complement to the UNHCR referrals, but I'm really glad to see this happen. It's something we've been advocating for over 20 years, often with Kelly at our side there. The other thing, in terms of response to that question, yes, it's hard to say what the average processing time is because it's all over the map, but the bottom line is we're now seeing refugees get processed within 3 months. So that's pretty remarkable, and hopefully that will become the norm. And these years-long processing times, like the one that I mentioned, the 32,000 people who were brought in recently who took 5 years or more to process, that will become the exception. It will no longer be the rule.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. One from Catherine McCaffrey. If an Afghan, for example, is in parole, can they convert their status to SIV possibly? And then do the parolees risk deportation, and what's the time limit?
I could jump in on that one. It's not, so Afghans are admitted as SIVs, and they are then lawful permanent residents. So they're in a fine situation. Afghans who came through Operations Allies Welcome, who came through parole, are really urged to seek asylum. And so parole has been extended along with work authorization, but the course that the government has hoped that people would take is to apply for asylum. And so when you are in parole status, it's designed to be a temporary status. So it does not give you permanent rights to remain in the United States. So that is why those who were in parole status who came as Afghans are urged to apply for asylum. And so the parole right now is time limited. It may or may not be extended, but the idea is that all Afghans who came through that process should be able to access asylum if they were not admitted as special immigrant visa holders.
Can I just add to Kelly's comments? The challenge with that, of course, is in suggesting to people they apply for asylum as you're putting them into that backlog system that we've all been talking about. Plus, it's a very formal, complex, challenging process. And if the individual is not represented by counsel to navigate that, their chances of winning asylum are pretty limited. So we've been advocating that we try to find another mechanism for these populations. And if we can't, that at the minimum, we provide them with counsel to help them with their asylum claims.
Add two things to that, which I totally agree with Wendy. on her points about whether there'd be another mechanism. The Afghan asylum cases are prioritized. They're not just in the backlog, so they are actually heard before any of the other backlog cases, except for mandamus cases. But I would also say that a critical problem has been that there are children in this backlog, and that they are not a derivative of an adult guardian or parent. So that is really critical to get them access to asylum. So we do worry about that as well. So I think another opportunity would be wonderful.
Thank you. We're about 5 minutes from 2 o'clock. I wanted to round off the panel by talking a little bit about what's at stake in November. We do have a question from Pierre Alchik asking about the elections and how that might impact refugee resettlement. His basic question is there any advocacy or action to separate immigration, especially refugee resettlement, from the complexities of politics and political parties? I don't think you can if you read the paper. But I guess the overall question is here, if there is and we try to be as nonpartisan here as we can, but there's a record for both of these candidates that are clear on refugees, because we had President Trump for one term. What are the consequences of a second Trump administration to all that's been built up over the last 4 years? I know that's sort of a obvious question in some ways, but there are some nuances there that we might be able to find. So anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll start, even though it is a precarious question, because as you noted, we're not political organizations. The fact of the matter is that the refugee program for most of my career, and I've been working in this since the Reagan administration, has been completely bipartisan with as much Republican as Democratic support. I would say that changed dramatically in 2015 after the global refugee crisis had finally caught the world's attention, with Ilan Kurdi's little body washed up on the shores of Turkey when he drowned, trying to escape with his family across the Mediterranean to Greece. I would, and I'm hoping that we can try to restore the bipartisan attitude and approach to the program, because the fact of the matter is that religious minorities are dependent on it. People who risk their lives to help the United States interests overseas are dependent on it. People who want to reunite with family here in the United States are dependent on it. And above all, it is a safe and legal alternative to crossing the border, risking your own life, right? So we want to revive it as a truly bipartisan program, and I haven't given up hope yet that we can make that happen this time, even though that was not the case in the first Trump administration, when the refugee resettlement numbers and the refugee resettlement ceiling plummeted from 110,000 to 15,000. Over.
Any other comments on that question?
I echo what Mark said. I think this can be a bipartisan issue, and I think it's an issue that really reflects the best of American ideals and democracy. And it's something we should be very proud of. I think that, this hyperpolarization, the environment we're in right now, is not helpful at all. I do worry about the use of programs like parole, which are highly discretionary, and I think they're being utilized by the administration because it's the only path forward at this point, right? Is to use discretionary programs that are fully at in the decision making that's done in the executive branch. I think, in addition to whoever's sitting in the White House, Congress being paralyzed on issues like this is not helping us at all. And we have a lot more to lose if we don't figure out a way to break through and bring people to a table and start talking about these really critical issues.
I echo everything that has been said. I would say that I would love to see support on the Hill for a caucus again, the Republicans and Democrats to caucus on our refugee and asylum issues. I think, you know, as opposed to many countries in the world, the differences between the right and left are not so extreme, but resettlement and refugee protection is something that should unite all Americans. So I really think I haven't given up, and I know many Republican and Democratic staffers haven't either. So I really do hope we will get back to the days where there was no debate about it, and I could explain, you know, very proudly to my European colleagues that we had broad bipartisan support.
We're at 2 o'clock. I want to thank all our panelists for their expertise and information that they've given us today. The recording will be posted in the next couple of days, so you can access that at cmsny.org. And if you want to follow up with any of the speakers, you can either contact them through their organizations, or you could contact Center for Migration Studies, info@cmsny.org, and we can either try to link you to the speakers or answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much for your time today, and happy World Refugee Day.